and different elements they have in place really do support special ed. I will speak about the RTI that's been put into place at Onco, and actually this RTI at the middle school and the increase in that academic support has really helped us to make sure we have the data to support that the student has received all of the regular ed interventions, which are a requirement for special ed eligibility. And also when students are dismissed from special education, it's important that we just don't leave them. We want them to have a system of supports to steer them away from having the intense support that a special education service would provide. Some of the priorities that we've talked about as well, the middle school social worker, half of that funding is proposed to come through special ed, and I believe somebody asked about how those would be split up. Since we're planning on funding part of it through local entitlement, we're going to have to determine how many students have to be seen per person in order to meet the salary requirements or the number requirements. And basically whatever's left over, which will end up being, I think, a whole person, will be dedicated to regular ed and then the other students that are needed. We talked a little bit about the increased need for that intensive behavioral programming. Fortunately, also one of my savings with the priority is the board certified behavior analyst that we have on staff has done this exact thing. She came from Portland where she did ABA treatment. She did a resource room that was dedicated to behavior. So this is something that she's very familiar with. So that would save on our resources and planning. We talked a little bit about the student support coordinator position, and some of the duties that we still need are more at the building level where we have federal and state guidelines where we're supposed to ensure compliance with timelines and deadlines and paperwork, and those things can't be managed from one office. It's really important that we're able to have somebody that's monitoring, does this go out 3 days ahead of time like it's supposed to? Because those are the things that we could get called on if we don't have things out when they're supposed to be. One of the biggest areas, probably the only large increase that I have, is some of the positions that we've held in local entitlement for over 2 years. We have to start taking that into our local budget. The goal of local entitlement is to support, not supplant. And if we keep it in any longer, there's some likelihood that it's not going to get approved. So I think that we've determined that there are some positions that we feel are necessary. There's a social work position at the high school that we have paid for through local entitlement. We have the office manager, part of her salary is through local entitlement, part of the BCBA is through local entitlement, and part of our school psychologist is also, and part of our speech and language pathologist. So we don't want to just throw everything on this year, but we do have to be mindful about thinking about a plan to take over those positions. So some of what you'll see in the budget is an increase in those positions. And the goal of this budget is to look at how we meet the needs of all learners, combining everything that's available to students. One of the board certified behavior analyst is just a little bit of a percentage dedicated to regular ed in her salary this year. And the idea is that we're going to increase more of that regular ed availability. That individual has done a lot of observations, interventions with regular education students. She's done a lot of assistance with bus discipline. She's been a really great resource for the student support team. So I feel like her knowledge and just having that person there is a very big savings, and not having to contract with somebody else or access another area of expertise. Our student support coordinators have done, I think, almost 50 evaluations this year, academic evaluations, and that takes away from typically a special ed teacher would be doing that. So that's a lot of time that they're not spending doing those assessments. And it takes a lot of pressure off teachers when they have to teach and write IEPs and meet with other teachers. A lot of the feedback that I've received this year about that position is parents feel like there's another person for them to connect with that understands special ed and understands law and understands the process. So that's been really good for them. And a savings on administration time too. That person is somebody that they're able to go to get their questions answered, and then that person is also part of the meeting. Another savings that we've been able to do this year, I think of a long-term savings is we've sent a lot of people out for professional development opportunities and not just special education teachers. There was a Sarah Ward executive functioning training that we sent quite a bit of people out, and it was a lot of people out on the day. But we were able to send regular ed and special ed teachers out, and those strategies that they worked, those people came back and they were excited. We've been able to send groups of people to have a similar training, so those strategies are implemented in the classroom with the same understanding and the same information. And I feel like the more that we can have in-house and the more professional development opportunities that we can give to our staff, who can then pass it on to more of our staff, not only builds capacity, but it's a huge money saver in the long run for us too. Unfortunately, we've been able to do more and more of the professional development. Through local entitlement and also through the local budget, knowing that MILTI, the computer program, is coming to an end, we've slowly started to purchase our own computers. So that will take out of the larger technology budget as we're looking to purchase more technology in the future. So this year we purchased 5 so far. I have the ability to purchase 5 more, and the idea is that I'm hopefully 5 and 5. One part of the year is 5, and the next part of the year is 5. And so hopefully within a couple of years we'll be able to be in some kind of rotating basis and not depend on a grant for the technology. We have done as last year. I had every teacher or every student that has a one-to-one ed tech, I've asked them to do an analysis of whether the ed tech is still needed in the intensity that they are. And we were able to reduce a total of 3 ed techs across the school department because we were able to look at the needs. We were able to look at potential groupings, potential classes, and all the other services that are now being provided that weren't there. So the need's just not there, and we fortunately have the data to support that, which allows monies to be spent in other areas that are needed. So now I will take us to the handout. So this year, we currently serve, at this moment, 163 students across grades K through 12 in special education, and the projected local budget that I'm proposing is right there. This is an increase of 7% from last year, and again, I explained that a lot of this is the result of us having to assume some of those salaries that we've been holding in local entitlement. The staffing projections, it is technically 15 teachers, but because we're looking at where and how that, if we move forward with another teacher, because there are students at the high school and students at the middle school, we would have to determine which percentage of each building would be paying for that teacher. So right now, because the students are at the middle school, that's how it's being budgeted. So just know that there's a potential for that other teacher. These are all nothing else is changing except the social worker, which we talked about the need for that, and the potential special education teacher. But nothing else changed since the budget last year as far as staffing goes. We do have as I spoke about, we have many unexpected out-of-district costs this year, and so we want to be a little bit more mindful about how we plan for that. We have to keep a certain amount in local entitlement, and we have historically kept a certain amount in our local budget, which has helped us when we have those unexpected out-of-district costs. The last part just talks about local entitlement, and then this lets we received $381,821.11. And that also includes monies for the 3-year-old and 5-year-old population. We actually, at this point, don't serve any students that are 3 and 4-year-old, but we do have children that enter kindergarten as 5-year-olds. So some of those monies support materials and staffing for them. Then we applied for the 18-19 grant in June, and we will not know the allotted amount until midsummer. Typically, we get a small percentage increase, but I don't expect it to be substantial. The next page.
What's reflected in the budget in terms of that?
I'm sorry?
But in terms of the grant that's applied for, what's reflected in the current numbers?
What we received this year is on the bottom. I don't know until it's approved. I don't even apply for it until the end of, or start the application process until the end of May.
Right, but it's money we may receive, correct?
Correct, yes.
And right now in the budget, what, do we have a zero, or do we have last year's number, or what do we have penciled in?
Maybe I can speak to that.
Yeah.
We don't include those funds in this budget. This budget that we're presenting is just general local funds.
Okay.
Those are outside the budget.
I'm
So,
happy to show
if
you.
we receive them, then what happens?
That they get spent separately. And what we do is we budget, like, this proposed social worker position, half of it would be budgeted under general fund, the local budget, half of it would be paid for out of local entitlement, which is separate from the funds that you're seeing here. I will provide you, later on, a report showing you all the different grants that
Okay.
we get and all the different monies
Okay.
that we get from them. They just weren't included with this initial binder.
Yeah.
If anyone's interested, I can show you how our money is allocated this year. It's really specific what we apply for and how we have to use it, and we have to build exactly how we said we were going to. So if anyone's interested, I can show you. Okay, the second page just talks about shows what the staffing is this year, and just to give an idea of what caseloads are across the different buildings. We do have 1.5 Ed Tech 1, and that is currently funded through local entitlement, and she is responsible for all of the special education filing, which is a very important job, and I would not want to lose the ability to have somebody that manages that for us. The student support coordinators, this is how their time is divided this year. Initially, we had thought that it would be split across the 3 schools, but the high school ended up not needing as much support. Right now, they're supporting teachers through the special ed process, they're doing a lot of the assessments, participating in the, you guys call it something different. In a student support team. So their role is a lot smaller there. I anticipate as we have more challenging needs coming up, that their role might be more at the high school and less at the other schools, but that's to be seen. Projected for 2018, 2019, we reduced the amount of ed techs, and these numbers are kind of in flux for the ed techs as well, because we have students at the high school level who haven't determined if they're doing a 5th year, and so some of those students are staffed pretty heavily, so we won't be able to have that information until the family or the IEP team has determined whether they're doing a 5th year. We also have, I believe, 4 one-to-ones moving up to the high school. So we have to look at whether the students can be grouped together, which classes they're in. So these are all, given the information that we have and the data that we have to support the need for the educational technicians, this is what we're proposing going forward as the need. Special education teachers, we're keeping pretty static across the 3 schools. If we look at the average caseload, I put in here including speech and language only students, because we have students that can qualify for special education for speech and language only. It is important that we have a case manager assigned to them, so the case manager can assist to make sure that the IEP document is in compliance with state and federal law. Although the speech and language pathologist does most of the work, the IEP in the process is the responsibility of the case manager, so it is an added load. But what I did, on the right side, just to show, if you take those out, this is the students that they're actually case managing, writing goals and objectives for, and more than likely doing all of the programming for. We like to keep the numbers smaller at the elementary level, just because those typically have a large amount of services. Early intervention is better, so that is reflected in the numbers. And on the next page, it just talks about, again, as of right now, we're proposing to do .8.8 Tom Coven Middle School for the student support coordinator and .2 for each position at the high school, but that can change based on the need, and that's the whole design of that position, is that they go and support where it's needed. The next section is enrollment, so these are all the enrollments currently. The projected enrollment, we had 7 students that we knew of coming in that had IEPs. 1 was just dismissed, so we at least have an idea of the students coming in from Child Development Services that would have an IEP, and we count those. We have significantly, we're not losing many special education students in 12th grade, and we're gaining quite a bit in 8th grade, so that's why the numbers changed a little bit there. And then if you look all the way over on the right column, we always have students in referral. So again, keeping in mind, if we're looking at 8.25 students per teacher at Palm Cove, if all 11 of those qualify, that adds to that teacher's load significantly. So we just want to be really mindful in planning that we allocate enough planning time and allocate enough time to case manage and to teach, knowing that those numbers are coming. And we've had quite a few referrals, and we have certain times of year that we have high referrals. This so happens to be one of them, because it's after report cards, so we tend to get referrals. The last page is the historical enrollment. And I think this is just interesting to look at how the different categories of eligibility have changed. When you think of a child with autism, autism is a huge spectrum. You have one child that has autism that could just need executive functioning skills. You have one child with autism that could be completely removed from the classroom for all academics and only with their typically developing peers for allied arts and lunch and recess and community building. So I think looking at these numbers, it just gives us a better idea of the population that we're dealing with. So we had a pretty big increase in other health impairment. We had a decrease in specific learning disability, and I can tell you it's probably because of the RTI that was put into place. Kids are being caught earlier, kids are being given the interventions earlier, and so there's not a need for that significant intensive instruction, which is involved in special education. And then on the last page, just because this is a language that we're familiar with in special education, but not necessarily might not know what each disability category is, so I just gave definitions similar to last year, what the definitions of the different eligibility categories are. Any questions?
Before you start, John, we have an hour. We have an hour.
I tried to make
1 hour to 150 pounds? Also quick.
So, can you just speak a little bit to as you said, a lot of times the head count numbers aren't descriptive, just also talk about how you see need changing, because that's really what drives hours and staffing. So, because we've got a relatively large population, some of that is moves slower and they're in the school system for a long time. But can you talk a little bit about the sort of overall needs and hours that are changing that might be different than what you'd see in headcount numbers?
Sure. The middle school is a perfect example of exactly what you just stated. We anticipated, based on the needs that we had last year, we anticipated that one social worker would be appropriate and able to meet all the needs of the students. And we missed the mark on that one. There is such an increased need in social work and in direct instruction in social work, especially with that age range and the need for navigating through being an adolescent on top of having other disabilities. I think of kids with specific learning disabilities. You can have a student that's eligible under the category of math, and you might think, okay, well, that's 30 minutes of math every day, but that's not necessarily just math. You have to think about, if a student isn't able to organize a math notebook or organize how to take a test, that's now executive functioning that you're laying on top of math. So there's a lot of planning, there's a lot of parent communication, there's a lot of team communication, per child. So I don't think I can quantify it, but I absolutely agree, every profile is.
I think one of the things that's helpful is to understand from your perspective if there are significant anomalies relative to headcount. For example, you talk about the social worker, you've got someone who's got 35 hours and they've got 30 of it already allocated, which is that means that doesn't count times where you actually have to go to staff meetings and read your email and walk to your room, things like that. But in terms of, are there anomalies in terms of that wouldn't be reflected in the head count? either up, positive or negative, that you would sort of say, we may have a low head count here, but we have a high need, that, you sort of spoke to a social work need at the middle school in that respect. Are there any other large ones that you want to highlight, that would be based on hours rather than head count? Because that would drive staffing.
Right. Well, I think, I think with the staff that we have, right now, I don't see, special ed is every year it's so different, so it's not necessarily that I can predict if there's going to be an anomaly. I mean, we've discussed the potential need for sending 5 kids out of district,
Yeah.
which was
Yeah.
completely unexpected. That wasn't something, given the profile that we had last year of these children, that we would anticipate happening.
So that's very helpful. The other thing I think that's helpful is to think about, we only have a few rolling off with special ed services, and that the other ones, the services for them are relatively constant, with the exception of some of the ones that had ed techs.
Not necessarily, because the idea is that we want a child to enter special education, get the interventions that they need, and then to be dismissed from special education. Maybe I'm not understanding your question. Maybe that's it.
So, again, what I'm trying to get to a little bit is you staffed currently based on the hours that you need within the IEP.
Correct.
Those numbers are not changing relatively fast, because there's only their needs aren't changing that fast, and you're only losing a small percentage, and you've got an unknown number coming in that you've prepared for.
Correct.
So, for example, you might, and the one that we do know about is the potential out-of-district one. So, I think it was challenging in the past when we were only looking at head count numbers, and before you were here, and we were also identifying a significantly lower than average number of special ed students. I was very concerned about, okay, you have a small staff, you have a low identification, how do we know our hours, it's the hours that are needed that should drive the staffing, and I wasn't convinced that was happening.
And that's what we do in the beginning of the year. We look at what the hours are on the IEPs, and, I mean, you're right, for most students, we can anticipate what it's gonna be for next year, what their hours are gonna look like. Unfortunately, the part that we can't predict is, we have, 19 students in referral right
Right.
now, and we had no idea how to anticipate that. Those students could be, I can tell you,
Right.
5 of those students are mainly behavioral challenges, which is going to mean that we are gonna need
Right.
somebody dedicated to them. So, yes, to speak to that point, I suppose those would be anomalies, but I wouldn't be able to necessarily predict.
I understand.
Yep.
But we've had this before,
Mhm.
where we were not comfortable with, we had a number of unknowns around special education, and part of the way we handled that was by making sure that we captured some of that real uncertainty in our contingency. And if you want to say that we really do have some significant uncertainty, particularly around, 19 in referral is a big number, particularly if I don't know what ballpark what the historical conversion rates are. You might be in a district where lots of people get referred, but really you don't have that many identified, or that most that are identified end up with services. But having no sense for what that looks like, or what the variation in that is challenging. But it does sound like that may be a significant risk in terms of uncertain cost and contingency. And so I would be, if we end up with, on the high end, are we prepared?
The time that I've been here, we've been able to absorb
Okay.
and then prepare for the future. And I have to say, the referrals that we're getting are more legitimate referrals. We have,
Yep.
just because of the RTI
Important to
that's in
know.
place. So I think we do have those systems in place, and if we have a kid that's moved through tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and they're still not making progress, we have a pretty good lens that's coming down, and, that the SST meets pretty frequently to talk about those. So I think we're in a better place to predict now than we were even last year about what needs are coming down the line.
So again, I return to that, are you comfortable with your current staffing levels with that number of sitting there in referrals?
I don't feel comfortable, putting forward another teacher or not knowing whether those are going to be whether they're going to qualify for special ed. I feel right now if I look at the different numbers, I mean, we have 11 referrals at Pond Cove, but our teachers, right now, we have 8 case students, so the state maximum, I believe, is 35. So I think we're in pretty good shape. But if I get to the point, where I feel we're kind of exceeding like we are at the middle school, he's had guidance counselors, he's had the assistant principal and himself kind of step in and absorb those. And if that's beyond what we can control, then we come to the board and say, hey, we have all this data to support, we're just not meeting the
I
needs.
understand. When I saw that large number of referrals, relatively speaking, for Pond Cove versus the other, it looks like an outlier, might have a significant amount of uncertainty. If it's not something that's covered in the budget, I want to make sure that we're actually, those are the kind of things you can more specifically identify, that we have more risk than we might ordinarily have for contingency, and address that there, and I'm just trying to gauge that.
I understand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
This isn't strictly special ed, but it's kind of a category of students that is in regular ed not. So I want to talk about 504 a little bit. And so the principals oversee 504, you oversee 504, and they're students who are not special ed students. They're regular ed students, but they have some different needs that need to be addressed. And so I kind of wanted to hear from principals or you, because that has an impact on staffing as well, and it can be, gray areas of, who's helping provide that support, because they're technically not special ed students, but, and it's a wide variety of students, speaking as a former 504 tutor. Would you mind just speaking about how that kind of impacts our staffing and the needs of the students? Jeff has spoken about it before in years past, but.
Do you guys want to start?
Sure, I will. So 504 is really an accommodation plan, not as much of a direct service. So oftentimes that may be for a short period of time. It's not a lifelong sentence to 504, hopefully. It could be somebody that has diabetes, it could be any range of things. So quite honestly, a lot of that workload in my building falls onto the nurse. The nurse actually does a lot of 504 support, and because a lot of it is health related. So it could be somebody breaks their leg and they need access to, the elevator. So they might need an elevator, guide or something like that. So I think it's less intrusive and it requires, it doesn't have the impact on staffing, I don't think, as much as a student identified, for special education. But
I'm thinking too,
I
like
think it
social
comes and
workers, though, a
goes.
lot of 504 can be mental health.
Yeah, and I think
And I
that
think
we
it's seen
do
a rise.
probably draw on the BCBA in those cases some for ideas and support, but the real implementation is mostly classroom teachers that kind of get that, and the nurse. The nurse is a huge asset and a very crucial person in our school.
I think part of why I brought it up wasn't just around special ed, but also another critical reason not to have a classroom with 29 students. Because the variety, and Jeff's back and he's gonna have my back on this, the variety of needs, I'm talking about 504. You can jump in with anxiety in a minute. But the variety of needs that teachers are addressing, and again, so in my own family, it's health related, but in another family, it might be mental health and whatever, and so that, those needs are, being addressed by classroom teachers, but social workers and guidance counselors and the nurse and that sort of thing.
And the whole social worker, and that's part of the big need that
Yeah.
we have, because.
That's, I was hoping somebody was gonna say 504,
Well, the
anxiety.
the resource is not being drained, but it's being fully,
Yeah.
taken somewhere else, and so it leaves a shortfall.
Mm.
And I think too, the ability, we have to have somebody that's able to help teachers know what those accommodations are, so they're able to implement, so we're in compliance. So, I agree that there might be that piece that we need to look at, and perhaps, I know that other school districts have a 504 coordinator. I don't think we don't have the kids to warrant that type of thing, but perhaps in the future, if we're looking at staffing, or if we have an extra staffing, or, something in mid-year, that might be something to look at, to assist with that, the little pieces of 504.
I have a question here. I'm looking at the numbers and for projected ones. I know you reduced education technicians, and I've noticed also that middle school and high school relatively the same number, and yet you have allocated more staff to the high school, not the middle school. How do you make those decisions of allocating the technicians?
The increase in numbers, so there's currently 6 educational technicians at the high school.
Yeah.
And we have 4 students that are moving up that
Okay.
require one-to-ones.
And then the middle school currently have what?
There's 10, I believe.
10, and this is reduced to 5, right?
Yes.
But on the projected here, it says 53 students, and referrals are 3, so that's 56.
The number of students for those grades we're basically saying, I believe, similar.
Yes.
And so
The average is different.
what those specific, the needs, the services that those specific students need are more intense.
So it is,
than
so
other
that's, yeah,
students.
so
Thank
it's
you.
not based on the number of students, but the
No.
type of
The
needs that they
services.
have,
Yeah, it's the
okay.
services that are required.
Right, that answers
Services
my
follow
question,
the
yes.
student need.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
As they often move from middle school to high school, or
And
high school
those,
to middle school.
and those technicians, are they part-time, full-time?
Full-time.
So
And
you-
some of the ed techs do the one-to-ones, and some of the ed techs
So-
are in a classroom with a special ed teacher providing services, because we do hire ed tech 3s for this purpose, so they can deliver curriculum under the supervision of a special ed teacher.
So we're losing 3 of them.
We are, based on the data that I have and the students that are leaving, we are able to reduce by 3 at this point.
And they are relatively easy to find in the future if we need them.
Sometimes.
Yeah, we don't need, it would be hard for me to be able to justify to keep them.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
just because again, everything that, all the one-to-ones that I have the data to support the need, and the other ed techs, we've established that they're needed in the classroom with the teacher and able to provide all of the amount of support that is given.
I want to make a remark. When I ask the questions, I guess I have my own thoughts, but I guess I do not relate my thoughts. When I mentioned the social worker and mentioned the grade difference, because my kids been through a whole school system. So a middle school 8th grader going to 9th grade have a lot of anxiety, and there is no transition support right now that I see. And same goes from Pond Cove to middle school. So if a social worker can be allocated to help those with anxiety of moving from one school to another school, and also help them transitioning it, whether it's reading materials or classrooms or number of classes taking. So I think if we can have a social worker that can float, or it could be allocated for the transition of the schools, would be nice.
I also think some of the duties that person would pick up are currently picked up by people that might be more prepared to help with those transitions. So school counselors maybe now are picking up some social work stuff.
Yeah.
That's
So-
getting in the way of some of the ability to do that. So I think it's about getting, people to be able to have the time to do what they're really good at.
People to do the right job.
I think also Freshman Academy was designed to specifically help the middle school, high school transition. It was a pilot program and now expanded, and they're already saying at the middle school, yeah, we need more social work, we have exactly this issue.
Okay.
So I think, yeah, you're on the right track, I think there's been motion in those directions.
And within the realm of special ed, I know that your comment was more global, but we do have the social workers, the social worker at the middle school go down to Pond Cove, in addition to the student support coordinator, to not only provide students with assistance with the transition, but parents too, have them have a familiar face from 4th grade to 5th grade, and also 8th grade to 9th grade, and people understanding on both sides what the needs of the student are, and then a consistent contact person.
Okay.
Any other questions for Jessica?
Thank you.